Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and today I'm taking a look at two model kits, one of which I received back when it was first released, and that is the 1/24th scale Supermarine Spitfire Mk.IXc from Airfix, and then very recently I was fortunate enough to be sent one of these, which is the same kit, but it's the Mk.VIII version. So join me in this video as I explore both of these kits and perhaps look at some of the differences between the toolings. But without any further ado, let's get straight into this one. As a side note for full transparency, this product was given to me free of charge by Airfix back when I went to visit the manufacturing facility as part of their launch event for this new product. And this product was also sent to me very recently free of charge by Airfix as a surprise in order to complete a review. So both products have been received free of charge for review purposes. However, all opinions do remain my own. So due to the magic of editing, I just want to explore how well they designed the shipping carton. So this is the shipping carton. Both Spitfires have the same, and it is basically like the perfect size. So this is the shipping carton for the Mk.VIII. But you open it up and you can see inside there that it's perfect size for it. So there's no moving around inside the shipping carton. So let's start off with the Mk.IXc. This is, as you can see, very beautifully illustrated on the front of the box. And if we look on the edge, we've got some images of the design work, and I think we may just compare that to the Mk.VIII as well. So both of them together, we can see that they are featuring the same information on the sides. However, the saturation on the lower one is a little bit higher. The color contrast is a little bit greater. The information coming along to this side seems to be the same. We have a cartograph logo on both of them, and also we have our tooling information. So for the top one, which is the Mk.IX, it was tooled and designed in 2022, which was back when I went to visit the factory where it was being made. And then down here, this one has it slightly edited to say 2022 design, but a 2024 release. You'll notice as well that here it does indicate that these were both designed and manufactured in the UK. So this is one of the products that Airfix has a full UK based production for it, apart from, of course, the cartograph transfers, because we know cartograph comes from Italy. If we flick onto the thin edges, we can see it just has the same information that we would see on the front of the box. Nothing too different there. But then on the other long edge, as we flip to the other long edges, we now have our product information. They are laid out slightly differently. That's because the Mk.IXc has 5 different paint schemes, but some of these are quite similar, whereas down here the Mk.VIII has 3 paint schemes in comparison. Over on the right hand side, we have our standard Humbrol colour callouts for the different paints that you may want to go and get if you fancy replicating the paint schemes included. And we do have 4 flying hours, which are coupons. Cut them out, keep them. If you're a member of the Airfix Club, you can redeem them against more kits. However, if you're not, please still save them and then post them on to Models for Heroes, where they can use them for their charitable work. Airfix indicates that this is a skill level 4 for each kit, being the most hardest and complex of the kits they have in the range. And over on the far left hand side, we have our product codes. The top one, the original version, is A17001, and the next one is A17002. And on the back of the box, and I hope that will show up on the camera, there is a slight embossing of the cardboard with the Airfix logo. I don't know if it will quite show up. I hope that you can see that. It is textured, so they've embossed the logo on there, which is something that we don't normally see from Airfix kits. So this is a slightly more premium feel to it. I would like to say as well that the box doesn't feel as glossy as other kits that I've had from Airfix. It has a bit more of a matte kind of finish to it. So the Mk.VIII on its front of the box has this image of the aircraft in use in the Pacific somewhere, and it does feature some Australian paint schemes, I believe an RAF version and a United States Army Air Force version, whereas the original release of the Mk.IX, we've got our image over D-Day crossing the channel, and on this one we have 1, 2, 3 RAF versions, one American version in Italy in 1943, but also a French version. I quite like the look of the French version in this one, so that's probably the one I would lean towards if I was going to do it. But I think it's time to get these boxes open and see what we've got inside. There we go. So it is a top opening box, and you can see that Airfix have changed slightly their packaging system. So we've got our wing component here. This is our lower wing, and then underneath that we've got some paper which is protecting our neck surfaces, which are the upper wing surfaces, and then underneath that some more paper, and then the remainder of the parts, some of them loose but others contained within plastic bags, so the clear parts and other sprues. So we have, by the looks of it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 grey plastic sprues. They are a slightly lighter grey than the more recent dark colour we've seen, and then a single clear sprue as well. So I'm going to take them out and put them to one side. We do have our instructions and a large decal sheet printed by Cartograph of all of the various decals, and then there on the inside you can see the embossing as well. So what I'm going to do is we want to draw a comparison. So paperwork then. I'm going to swap them around, and I'm going to put the Mk.IX on the left and the Mk.VIII on the right, because that one was the original one and that one was the new version. We do have paint scheme information, which I'm just going to put to the top of the screen there, so I can keep them separate. And we have our little books, and they are to the normal format from Airfix, with information about the actual aircraft at the top and some hints and information about the cleaning of the sprues if needed, to remove any grease that may be left over. Turning over the page, it's exactly the same format. However, you may notice that there are some slightly different colour callouts, because naturally they require different paints, because they are different paint schemes. So we'll turn over, and starting off we have the exact same instructions. The first one is about our position of our cockpit details, and the relevant decals that need to be applied to them. And if we look over the page, we then move on to assembly of the cockpit. We progress on through the assembly of the various cockpit components, and then we look at assembling the sidewalls. They look to be the same, no differences there. However, step 15 looks a little different, in that it says we can use a component if we're going to be using painted instruments, or if we're using decals, whereas in this case it says that we're only using painted instrument panel. There is also a small inlay here for another component which is missing on this one. Carry on though, everything else remains the same. It's quite handy that they've done these with elements of colour as well, because it makes it more obvious as we go through. These steps are the same. We've got seat belts which we can include as well. Control column. These are the same, installing various components here. We do have the options for our controls here being different components by the looks of it, or the same components but modified in some respects. In this case we've got 3 different modifications, whereas in this case we've only got 2. We carry on down. Down here we do also have another part, D5, which needs to be painted different colours depending on the variant, but in this one it's just painted one colour. And then we move on to the next page. At 32 we do have some differences. So at 32 on the Mk.IX we just add in our sort of rear of the tail. However, in this one we do have some differences, and that's because the Mk.VIII had a slightly different airframe compared to the Mk.IX. So we do need to pay attention. There is some modification that needs to be made, cutting and sanding. After this, however, we come down to our door, and it is the same on both. And then we have our other internal bits on our fuselage, and again there are some slight differences depending on the variant that you want to do. Moving on down, we install our cockpit. It is the same for both of them, so we'll turn over the page. Internal cockpit details are the same at stage 38. We do have some differences at 39 where things need to be painted different colours in the Mk.IX variant. But after this we assemble our other components for our internal areas, and these are the same. However, 43 does have a difference, and this will be related to the fact that the landing gear in the Mk.VIII was retractable, whereas in the Mk.IX it wasn't. And then we look at our door here, and it does make reference that there are 3 different options for the door, depending on whether you want to have the door closed with the canopy closed, the door closed with the canopy open, or the door open and the canopy open. But again, these steps seem to be the same. Moving on down here, we assemble our fuselage, and these parts are the same as well. And so too are these stages. However, there are some differences here depending on the variant. So in the Spitfire Mk.IX we've got 2 different options, whereas for the Mk.VIII we only have 1 option. So there are some slight differences on your tail surfaces for the Mk.IX. We come on down, we assemble our various tail surfaces together. You can see the steps have been slightly repositioned at this point, because these are ahead because there were less steps for the tail surfaces. We can assemble our rudder, and for our Mk.VIII we have a slightly different rudder. It has a bit more of a higher tailplane, so it has a different shape. And then we come on to assembling our internal wings, which appear to be the same step, and so too are the internal sort of braces that go in. Does make reference that we don't need to glue these things, they just need to be snapped in, and also that we need to use this part as an alignment guide, but we don't need to glue it in until much later on. These steps seem to be the same for both aircraft, and so too are these. These seem to be the same. We have the option to display internal weapons bays open, and we can paint up those relevant parts. We also have a lot of the ribs which go on the inside of our aircraft, which can be displayed, or at least as seen when we've assembled various elements. These seem to be exactly the same construction steps. Nothing has changed here, so we will move on. Having reached step 82, there is a small point here that something is different. There is an extra component for some of the variants, whereas it just seems to exist at 82 in this case. We can install parts that represent a gun, a cannon by the looks of it, and there are parts which have to be installed if you are doing this with the gun bay open. However, these seem to be the same throughout this section. We have our machine guns that we can add into the wings. We have our panels, which say that we can leave the panels off so we can see the gun bay details, which is a nice addition. So we'll turn over, and here we are at the point where we join our fuselage. But in essence, these steps are the same, and it would appear that these steps are mostly the same. However, depending on the variant, there is a different blister for your cannon bay, whereas on this one it is just the one. It is worth noting that there appears to be clear parts here which go into the lower wings, which are not required on the Mk.IX. Turn over the page. We have they look like the air intakes and radiators. These steps all seem to be exactly the same. It is nice that they've molded on here that different things need to be pointing in different directions, so that's handy to the modeler to know. And here we seem to be installing them into the aircraft. We do have the option in the Mk.IX whether we want to do some with clipped wings or normal wings, whereas for the Mk.VIII it doesn't seem that we have that choice. And this makes reference to the engine. So an engine component is included. However, if you're gluing your panels on, you don't need to build the engine inside. You can just glue the panels onto it. The engine, however, could be assembled separately and displayed as its own model because it does appear to be quite nicely detailed. These steps for the engine are the same in both cases. However, when we get to this point here, there is a slightly different air intake by the looks of it, depending on the variant for the Mk.IX. However, for the Mk.VIII, it remains just this longer version. This is installing the sort of panels and frames around the engine, and they appear to be the same for both aircraft up until we get to this point, which is about installing that cowling element for that air intake we just discussed. So naturally there will be different parts for that, but as we come down we add our cowling, and there are other parts of the engine here that we can assemble if we want to have the cowling open, and they look to be really nicely detailed, and they seem to be the same throughout. And this should give a nice representation of the Merlin engine. There's quite a lot of parts here. Yep, there's loads of little details here. These steps appear to be exactly the same. I think it is worth mentioning there is a small edit here at 175. They say that we need to cut through this part here, but it's not referenced on this one. I wonder if that's because as people have been assembling it, they've realized that actually you need to have maybe a bit of extra flex or something in order to install the parts. So yeah, here yes, this will be why. So they've discovered a difference whilst people have been building this, that if you don't cut this part here, you will struggle to pass your pipe work sort of behind and out of it. So you can see it's on the outside of this part, but I imagine people were struggling to get it into place without cutting it. So that's a fix by the looks of it. They've gone in and edited in a fix for a problem that has been flagged up. We continue assembling these pipe works. We can add our engine onto the frame, and then we can add it into the nose. These steps seem to be the same with no differences, so you can have a very nicely detailed representation of the Rolls-Royce Merlin straight out of the box in the front of the aircraft. And then we get to the air intake step that we saw previously, which are going to have differences. And there is mention here of adding panels. However, as mentioned previously, if you don't want to have your engine displayed, why bother? Why not just glue your panels in? So we get down to this point, our engine exhausts all come as separate parts, and then we have the option to have our flaps either glued in a raised position or in a drooping lowered position. And then we have the option to have landing gear raised or lowered, depending on our preference, but these steps seem to be the same. We're nearly at the end. This is a big kit, so this video will probably take a little while. The wheels come with separate hubs. There are different hubs depending on the variant that you're doing. As we progress down, we glue our landing gear legs together. We add in our landing gear covers, nearly at the end, very close. And then there will be a slight difference at the tail wheel. As mentioned, the Mk.VIII had a retractable tail wheel. So for the Mk.IX, this is just a matter of passing the tail wheel through a hole and gluing it in because it was fixed, whereas on this one we do have a few extra components and a landing gear covers that should open and close. Naturally, you'll have to decide whether you glue them in the closed or the open position, depending on whether you have it lowered or raised. Then we move down and we start to assemble our reflector gun sight by the looks of it, and depending on the variant there are slightly different options. This gets glued into our cockpit. There are on the Mk.IX some slight different choices here depending on the variant for what is potentially a light at the top of the aircraft. And then we get to the cockpit canopy. And here, these steps are the same. This appears to be the same. So everything here is the same. And we come to our propeller as the final step. And the propeller is assembled in the exact same manner, separate blades. Not a massive fan of separate blades, but on a bigger scale it's probably more manageable. Glue that together and add it onto the model. So that should have you a completed kit. So the paint schemes that are included, as discussed, I'll very quickly run through these because I don't want this to be a massive video. The Mk.IXc has, I think it was 5. So the first one is a Mk.IXc from 1944 of the RAF, and another one from 1943, again of the Royal Air Force, but they have very similar paint finishes, the same camouflage scheme, naturally different serial codes because they're different aircraft. But the thing to note between the two primarily is that this one has D-Day stripes because it would have been used around that time. The next one is another RAF aircraft flown by Johnny Johnson. So probably one of the more famous ones, but being 1943, no D-Day stripes are present. If we flip over, we have a 9C of the United States Army Air Force from 1943, this time being used in Italy. So with the blue and earth and sand colours on the top, a little bit more interesting visually due to the fact that it is American, and it does make a change from the typical types that the Americans would have flown. The final one is a Spitfire Mk.IX of the French Air Force or Armée de l'Air, and this is a 1945 example, which is, in my opinion, slightly more interesting because it does have more colour on it. It has the French colours on the tail, the roundels naturally being the French ones are a little bit different to the typical RAF ones, and we do have these yellow stripes and a red spinner on the nose. So I would be more tempted to do this one because I tend to do a lot of RAF aircraft, so having a French one would be interesting to have in the stash. On the back of this one we do have all of our common stencil data, and with that let's look at the Mk.VIII. So these, the older 2022 release, had 5 decal schemes, all quite similar, but what I think probably was worth mentioning is that although in the instructions it did make reference to having clipped wings, the only one that I can see that had clipped wings was the French one. Naturally, if you had second party or aftermarket decals, you could potentially replicate any particular scheme you wanted to. For the Mk.VIII then, there should be 3 schemes in this one. So the first one is a Royal Australian Air Force example, which has dark green, and actually it has different shades of green on this one, on the tail in particular. So it's got a dark green and then a slightly more vibrant green and a couple of shades of grey, but it's got the sharp teeth on the nose, and it's got this white wing or leading edge element with a red spinner, which is interesting. That's a 1945 scheme. Then we have, I presume this is a RAF aircraft, but naturally someone correct me down in the comments. Again, a slightly more interesting scheme with dark earth, dark green, light grey underneath, and then we've got some white bands on the wings which we've got measurements for. And then the last one is a United States Army Air Force aircraft. This is again an Italian example, but it's painted in overall grey. I did build a 1/72nd scale example very similar to this one a number of years ago, and they were sort of used as your personal transports for squadron commanders and things at that time. I quite like this one again because it's a little bit more interesting, and it does have these different colour schemes on the tail. I don't know if I would do this one, but it would be interesting to have this one and then display my little 1/72nd scale version on the wingtip just to show how scales work. But yeah, so 5 with the Mk.IX, 3 with the Mk.VIII, but a number of the ones in here, I think 3 in here, were very similar. So those are those 2 done. Now we can look at the transfers. So these decal sheets are printed by Cartograph. You can see that the backing paper is ever so slightly different colour. The one on the right is a little bit more of a vibrant blue, and they are slightly different sizes. But as mentioned, the Mk.IX had slightly more decal schemes, so it would make sense that one will be slightly bigger. So the Mk.IX then has a lot of different transfers on there for the various different kinds of aircraft that you could replicate in the kit, all printed to a very high quality. As is to be expected from Cartograph, all of the small little stencils seem to be quite legible. There's no registration issues, and the transparency of the colours is really good as well, which I would imagine would be the same case for the Mk.VIII. You can see we've got our shark's teeth on there, quite large transfers naturally due to the size of the aircraft, and we've got our red stripes for our tail done as transfers, which will make it easier rather than having to mask and paint if you're not a fan of doing that. But once again, registration is good, opacity is good. On the whole, very nice looking transfers. I would anticipate there be no issues applying these onto the model kits. So, in an attempt to not mix everything up, I've put my instruction booklets back down. So Mk.IX on the left, Mk.VIII on the right. Hopefully we'll get it correct. So the Mk.VIII on that side, Mk.IX on that side. So we have here our fuselage halves. They appear to be identical because it would make sense that they would be. The detail level on these is pretty nicely done, to be honest. There is a slight little bit of dirt on there, but that just easily brushed off in my hand. The plastic doesn't feel particularly greasy. It feels quite supple. It doesn't feel brittle. There is a little bit of flex, but not a great deal. And this is it looks like slightly like different or older plastic that we were used to from Airfix. Not as dark grey as the stuff we see from India. But on the whole, pretty nice. Details are really nice. Lots of tiny little rivet details. This is possibly one of the best detailed Airfix kits that I've ever seen. Flipping over onto the inside, we have our ribs for the internal details, as well as some rivet details as well. There are ejector pin marks in a few places, but they don't feel too bad, and I'm hoping as well that they're going to be hidden. Some of them are in areas where you're not going to see them in the finished aircraft. There is, and I didn't notice it on this one, if the video will catch it, is there's a slight waviness here from the mold, perhaps where they machined it, but it doesn't feel prevalent. I wonder if the other one has the same. Yeah, this one has it as well, so it's obviously on the mold. It's on both sides actually. It's on the tooling itself rather than actually like part of the plastic, but yeah, it is on both of them. So that's a consistency, but hopefully we shouldn't see that in the finished build. So let's put them down. Mk.VIII, Mk.IX, Mk.VIII, Mk.IX. So this is a little sprue with our engine cowling top, and again these are identical, no issues on that. And then we have our lower wing surfaces, and again these are molded to a very nice quality. However, you can notice that on this one there is a difference. We've got an extra hole for a light, and on this one we don't have that. So there are some detail differences between the two sprues. You can see on, I'm sure this is the Mk.IX one. I'm getting all confused now because I'm looking at two different kits. I'm sure this is the Mk.VIII in my right hand, and you can see that we've got our little hole here for our light, but also you can see that we have on this one extra gun port ejectors, and also we have our lower light holes here as well. So these, although they're both sprue Bs, they are separate toolings. Again, there's some small little details down here which are different as well, which would make sense because the aircraft was a different airframe, and there are some subtle differences with the panels as well. The panels have differences on them as well. So they haven't just taken the Mk.IX version and then just made some edits. It is a completely different tool. On the inside, nothing really of note, but ejector pin marks again are in different places because they are different tools. So yeah, that's interesting. So now we can look at our wings, our upper wings, and let's just, hang on, wing C, C's down there. Yep, these are different tools as well. You can see they've laid them out in an opposite direction. Yeah. So on the Mk.IXc, the wing ribs are in the bottom left and these are on the bottom or top right. So the wings must have differences as well. And if we look closely, I hope I will be able to spot some. Yeah, so like down here we've got a little bit of detail. It's sort of with the panels where they would do maintenance, they are different. So there are some subtle differences between them. So once again, they haven't just taken the Mk.IX tool and changed it or, you know, just released it again. It is a completely different tooling, but with variances based on the particular version that you're doing. So that's interesting. I'm not going to get everything out of the bags because I'll be here for ages if I do that. But I just wanted to draw comparisons. So these are Sprue K, Mk.VIII in my right hand, Mk.IX in my left hand. They do, as far as I can tell, look to be identical. And in the same bag, if we flip over, we have Sprue's H. However, they do look to be the same, but they've been put in the bags in opposite directions. But on the whole, the same parts seem to be present. So they seem to be duplicates. So these are the Sprue E's. Sprue E sort of consists of like 3 sprues all joined together, which is actually EF. What are we looking at? E, N, and J are all joined together. These are exactly the same from what I can see here, and it is worth noting on the tyres, if it will show up on the camera, we do actually have a Dunlop branding on some of them, which is pretty nice. I do notice actually on the one for the Mk.IX, not the Mk.IX, the Mk.VIII in my right hand, the Mk.VIII on this side, you can see a little bit of flash there around the frame, but it doesn't seem to be present on the parts. I can't see any flash on the parts, it just is around the frame. But it's not surprising over time that flash does creep in, but generally that's just on the frame that I can see, so not an issue. We flip over to look at D. Sprue D for both of them seems to be the same components, but as before, these have been put in a different orientation. The Mk.VIII in my right hand, Mk.IX in the left hand. This is Sprue. I don't know, it's got all the wing ribs in it and the machine guns. They are the same, but they've just been put in the bags in different orientations. And then on this side, we have our tail surfaces, etc. But these again are exactly laid out the same. So these are the same sprues, no differences here. In the last bag, well technically it's the last bag, so Mk.VIII in my right, Mk.IX in my left. This is Sprue L. These are your engine cowlings and propeller spinners. These are exactly the same in both models, and there isn't anything of note here. Again, detail is really nice and moulding is very crisp, but they are identical. We come to our clear parts, and I think in this bag, in the Mk.IX, you can see there's a bit of plastic, you know, that moving around, but that is not a part, I don't think. That looks like a bit of sprue, so not really an issue. In here, the parts are identical. Again, no differences between them that I can see, so it's a reproduction of both. The plastic parts look to be really nice. Again, I will get out one of them to have a look at. So this is the Mk.VIII version, so the Mk.IX should be exactly the same. I think if you want to take a really deep dive at some of these sprues and things, definitely worth checking out one of our friends to take a look at, because I know some of them have made some excellent videos on these. But yeah, this was more of a comparison between the two. But yeah, this is very nice. Even the sort of bubble bit of the canopy is very nicely reproduced. No blemishes, no sort of blurs. It is probably worth noting that there is an ever so slight mold seam down the center of this one. It's hardly noticeable, but it's like a hair. it's like a hair's width, but I can see it. But it doesn't seem to be noticeable on this one. I think that's probably just a result of the fact that they couldn't use a slide mold because it would push the price up even more. The whole point of sort of designing this kit was to try and get a 1/24 scale kit under £100, which I think that's what they're retailing for, but I will check by the end of the video. So yeah, clear parts. And if you had purchased the Mark 9, that would be it. However, the Mark 8 does come with an extra sprue. So the extra sprue for the Mark 8 features the different, the ailerons, different sort of parts for your tail to replicate that raised and lowered landing gear, and some other small differences pertinent to the Mark 8. So this is Sprue P, and you only get the Sprue P in the Mark 8, and there is another control panel here. But again, details on this are absolutely fantastic, and it's really crisp, really subtle rivets and things throughout these aircraft. So that is pretty much that. I hope I haven't mixed anything up. I think maybe it's time to wrap this one up. So there we have it. Effectively, we had two large 1/24 scale Spitfires. In the Mark 9, we had 433 parts, whereas in the Mark 8 we have 452 parts. Naturally, you may get more parts with that extra sprue in the Mark 8. However, in the Mark 9 you are getting two extra paint schemes, albeit very similar to some of the other ones that exist within the kit. If I was going to do the Mark 9, I'd probably be tempted to do the French version, and if I was doing the Mark 8, I'd probably be tempted to do the United States version, but again, we'll have to see, being such a massive project, when or if I'll ever get time to get this one completed. The Mark 8 does come with different parts to replicate the fact it was a slightly different airframe. Particularly the ones that I noticed was the upper and the lower wings seem to be completely different toolings, and also you get that extra Sprue P, which represents elements of the raised retractable tail wheel. However, Airfix did evidently pre-plan the fact that this kit was going to be released, so they had molded elements of it into this tooling as well, so that they didn't have to double hand themselves too many times on their toolings. Instructions seem to be relatively easy to read. The decals looked absolutely beautiful, and everything was really nicely crisply molded. As mentioned, I haven't gone into a massive deep dive into every single part and every single sprue, because otherwise this video would be absolutely massively long. But if you would like to take a look at a deeper dive into a specific unboxing, I will link a couple underneath the video to give you a second opinion. It's always nice to have a second opinion. So as mentioned, when we went down to the factory where they were making the Mark 9 in the UK, it was told to us that they were aiming to get a model kit in 1/24 scale with good levels of detail and fit of parts, which would be retailed for under £100. At the moment, when I'm making this video in 2024, this is retailing for £94.99 on the Airfix website. I do know it has been included in parts of bundles, which would allow you to get like the little guidebook to go along with it. I did actually get given one of these as well, which is a bit of a extra blurb, just talking about the different aspects of the design with some CAD renderings on there as well, and mention of some of the transfer schemes which are included in the kit. As this is the older version, the 2022 release, it is slightly cheaper than the Mark 8 version. So the Mark 8 version, at the time I'm making this video, it is technically only available to pre-order. So this was a pre-release, or well, it's a production release, but it's pre the official release of the model. This was on the website at £99.99. So there's a difference of £5 between the two models. Naturally, this one being the more recent one is slightly more expensive, but the difference isn't massive. So this one may be slightly better value due to the fact it has more paint schemes, but don't forget as well that this one does have more parts for the specific variant that you have included. So there isn't really a great deal between them. Personally, I'm not sure which variant I prefer. I think maybe the Mk.VIII is slightly more interesting due to the fact it has that raised landing gear, but the Mk.IX is probably more popular and more easily recognizable. But I think though it's probably time to wrap this one up here. This has to be one of the most impressive looking model kits that I've looked at in my time on the channel, and I am very grateful for Airfix for sending out both samples in order to review. Let me know, however, what you thought of my assessment down in the comments below, and any other suggestions you might have for other videos you'd like to see. As always, a quick shout out to my channel members and patrons for the extra support they give the channel via the Model Club. If you'd like to join the Model Club and find out what becoming a member means, take a look at the links in the description. Alternatively, there are other ways to help support the channel if you'd like to do so. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.